Lance, welcome, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Just to remind our viewers, we are having a talk uh, on by meeting people who use APS products. My name is Kris Gorski, and I'm one of the co-founders. And we had an idea to basically periodically meet with people who use our products and are pretty good at doing so. And so I'm really looking forward to this. Lance, I've obviously known a bit of your work up till now, and I've read some more, and I'm pretty impressed. It's a very strong career you're having there. So I'm pretty impressed by Nick Cave's album as well. I've been listening to it, and I really enjoy it. I really also like the fact that you're very you go into many styles. You're not afraid of doing a lot of different styles, which is not very common. Very
Whoever
often
hired me, really.
exactly. So I gather you're from New Zealand, right?
Yep, from New Zealand originally. I was there till I was about 26, 27. It's a really cool country. After like 27 years, it starts to feel a bit smaller. So then I moved to New York and then was there for a while and then ended up out in Los Angeles now, where I am sitting right now.
Okay, so while we've been preparing for this meeting, I've asked if we could do this in a little bit of a different way to start how you tell about your career. So the idea we have is that you start from now and you go back in time to tell us how you ended up here.
Right, so I'm basically a freelance engineer, I guess, these days. I do a lot of live touring work as well, but probably my biggest staple is all my studio work. I've got my own little space that I'm sitting in right now, which is in Los Angeles. It's in a building owned by Evan and Manley from Manley Labs, and there's a couple of other engineers and producers that have got rooms here as well. But it's a pretty cool little space. I had so much gear that I'd built up over the last few years, and acoustic panels and stuff like that, that I needed somewhere to put it. And so instead of having it set up at home, I kind of just came out and rented a space and set it up and did it properly. So yeah, I've been in Los Angeles for just over 2 years now. Got my space here. I do a lot of work out at Woodshed Recording in Malibu. I was the studio manager and in-house engineer there for the last couple of years as well. And so yeah, I worked for a guy called Richard Gibbs that owns that place, and it's this really, really nice studio out in Malibu. It's quite interesting place. If people go to woodshedrecording.com and check it out, it's a really unique studio. It's this big kind of open room that overlooks the ocean, and it's in really nice area. You see the Santa Monica Bay, and you can see like planes going into LAX, and this really nice view. It's got this big garden around it, and by default it's this one big open room, and it's got these kind of moving walls inside the studio, and they go from floor to ceiling, and they'll seal up so you can make different rooms within the room. So you can create like a control room and a live room, or you can have like a big open space with just a vocal booth, or you can have a vocal booth and a piano room and then your control room. And then as well, it's got ISO booths down in the basement with like the Leslie that's connected to the Hammond, and it's got guitar cabs down there, and the bathroom's connected through tie lines, so you can put mics and speakers in the bathroom and all sorts. And then the console and the rack of preamps and everything, like basically everything's on wheels, and all the wiring has been tripled around the room, so you can take the whole control room gear setup and move it into one of the booths if you want. So if you want to have like a big open space for an orchestra to play, you can set up the tiny little vocal booth, but actually put the control room gear in there and like kind of work from there. So it's this kind of unique little space there. But yeah, so I spent a couple of years working out of there. It's kind of what I moved to California for in the end. And did like the Nick Cave album out there. I've done all sorts of stuff with Charlie Puth and Shawn Mendes, did a lot of stuff there, and Barbara Streisand does stuff there, and Coldplay's did a lot of stuff there, like kind of a lot of Malibu acts and a lot of California acts, and then a lot of people that would fly in and kind of rent out the house and stay there on the property and do their albums. But then in November 2018, we got slammed by the Woolsey fires. And if you remember the California fires that came through, so they swept through Malibu and kind of destroyed a lot of stuff. And they came through our neighborhood and they burnt down the house on the property. They burnt it completely to the ground. There was nothing left of it all. and the neighboring, I think about 10 or 11 houses around us got burnt down completely as well. It kind of looks like, when you looked at the overhead map, it looks like a meteorite had come through and just like kind of destroyed the place. But the studio was still left standing, like virtually untouched by the fires. It was bizarre. We think it kind of got saved partly by the garden that was around it. There's this really healthy garden. And when fires come through, it turns out it doesn't really burn really green stuff. It just burns all the dried up stuff. And because the studio was built properly as well, it was like kind of really well isolated. And so when something's really soundproof, it means it's kind of more or less airtight as well. And so when you got an airtight space, when the fire comes through, like there's no like kind of draft that goes through. There's nowhere for the embers to get inside to burn it. There were a few studios around Malibu that just got left alone by the fire when everything around them got burnt. So Woodshed was one of those ones as well. But there was massive smoke and ash damage, and like the walkway and fences and everything around it had kind of burnt, and we had no power for 4 or 5 months. And so it's kind of a bit of a disaster from that point of view. So I spent most of last year kind of dealing with insurance companies and contractors, and we kind of got everything ready to go and got the studio up and running. And then, once it was up and running, I went and did some more touring stuff and kind of came and set up my own little room over here and went from there.
What was before then?
Well, I've been doing touring stuff for a few years too. So I do a lot of work with the band Wilco, based out of Chicago. We tour a lot of North America. We've done Europe a lot of times. We've done South America. They do the whole world really. And I was meant to be sitting in Belgium right now, I think either London or Belgium, doing production rehearsals for Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. We were meant to start a tour next week, going all through Europe, but that got postponed to next year. So the next touring thing I've got is coming up in, I think I've got a Wilco tour in August and a Nick Cave tour in September around North America, assuming the pandemic starts to die down and, you know, live shows come back up. Actually, I'm meant to be in Europe with Wilco at the end of June doing some stuff, doing some festivals, but who knows? I don't think it's been cancelled yet, but I don't know. We'll see what happens. So before that, before California, I was in New York City. I was living in Manhattan. I spent a few years working at Platinum Sound Recording Studios, which is in just off Times Square. The studio since shut down and they've reopened downtown because the real estate is crazy in New York and the rents are just ridiculously high. To run a commercial studio in New York City, it's like I don't know how people do it. It's basically impossible. You need to use every square foot of real estate in the building needs to be used for something, and you need to have every studio booked out basically every single day to make it viable. So it's really tricky.
So do you mean the actual, that beautiful coffin kind of room, acoustic room of that studio is gone?
Platinum Sound?
Yeah.
Coffins?
Was it this one? Wasn't it this one, or was it? No, it was Powerstation. Sorry, of course I mixed up.
Right.
Powerstation had that, but that's still going on, right?
Yeah, Powerstation, the building got sold and they kind of were about to shut down, and Berkeley bought them.
Okay.
So it's still being used partly as a studio and partly as an educational institute, I think. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean, like running a commercial studio, it's impossible unless you got something else going on. So if it's a school as well, I guess it makes sense. So Platinum Sound was owned by Jerry Wonder. He used to be he's a really well-known producer. He used to be one of the founding members of the Fugees. He did like a lot of the production and he played the bass, and he was kind of like the hitting guy from the Fugees. His cousin is Wyclef Jean, and they built the studio together and like kind of started it together. So yeah, when I worked at Platinum Sound, that was Jerry Wonder owned it and he did all his production out of there as well. So it was kind of 50% Jerry's stuff and 50% just people booking it and labels booking it or whatnot. The head engineer was Serge Tsai. So I kind of learned a lot of him. And then, yeah, there's a few of us on the engineering team as well. So I spent a few years doing that. I was there from 2012 to 2015. And so when I got there in 2012, I just moved to New York and somehow got a job down there. They had like 150 applicants or something, and I never expected to get it. So when I went for the interview there, I was just kind of like, I just really wanted to see the studio. I even like woke up late on the day and was almost just going to not go. And I thought, might as well go and see what it's like. So I went down there, and I think because I just had no pressure on me there. I guess everyone else, it was like the opportunity of a lifetime, but I was just meant to be in New York for a year. That was it, just on the short-term working visa that I had. and I thought it was just a cool opportunity to go see the studio. So I just chatted to the manager there and just kind of saw it, and it was really cool. But I guess I was laid back enough that they quite liked me, and they had me back for more interviews and had to do a little Pro Tools test and whatnot, and got a job there. So yeah, the first day there, I was like doing did a session with a Motown artist on the first day. The second day, I was working with an artist called Fantasia. I think he'd recently won American Idol or come second or something in American Idol. And then by the end of that first week, I was doing recording sessions with an artist called Miguel, who I hadn't even heard of at the time. I had no idea who he was. I thought Miguel was turned out to be one of the interns walking around. It wasn't them at all. So I did sessions with Miguel. Ended up doing a ton of work on that album, a bit of mixing, a lot of engineering, a lot of 7 a.m. finishes, a lot of really long days. When we finished that album, we worked for 4 days non-stop. We started on a Sunday afternoon and finished up on the Thursday night when we, took it to mastering. And then that album ended up getting like a bunch of Grammy nominations, and it kind of went #1 on the charts, and, kind of blew up and became a big thing. So that was kind of my big kind of eye-opening, introduction to New York, and kind of introduction into the big world of recording. So yeah, did a lot of stuff after that. New York kind of went into a bit of a recession as far as the music industry is concerned from there. So the first year I was there, it was like all major label stuff we were doing. The second year was kind of 50% major label, 50% like independent artists. And then the third year, it was kind of all just independent, like basically kind of kids from Brooklyn rapping over MP3s sort of thing. And a lot of just like kind of, keep the sessions coming in to like pay the bills and keep the studio lights on. But there wasn't like kind of the exciting stuff that we'd had the first year. And that wasn't anything exclusive to Platinum Sound. It was kind of New York was just generally like that. Like all the studios were shutting left, right, and center, and everyone was kind of struggling. A lot of people had come out to LA. So yeah, as it started to kind of go down, I had an opportunity to do some touring stuff and go freelance. So I took that up and, started doing stuff with Wilco and started freelancing around New York, and then doing a lot of traveling and just freelancing kind of everywhere. And then, yeah, in 2016, I think it was, when the elections happened in America, like when the Clinton versus Trump elections happened, like I didn't really get into politics, like American politics I kind of hate, but it was this really ugly election cycle. There was a lot of just like division and fighting, and like just a lot of really negative news that came out. And so I was touring Europe when the election happened and Trump won. I thought, oh God, this is going to be really ugly for the next few months while they're, transitioning the White House and all that. So I thought, you know what, I'm not going to go back to America. I'm going to go somewhere else and just kind of let like sit this one out, let them do all their stuff. And when it settles down a bit, then I'll go back to America and, and resume. So I decided to basically buy a one-way ticket down to Argentina. I was about to we're finishing up a tour in like the November of that year, and the next tour wasn't starting till March the next year or something. So I thought I'll just get down to Argentina, have a bunch of steak, drink a bunch of wine, just hang out down there for a few months, because I'd been there a couple of times before and really enjoyed it. So yeah, I put together a little like kind of studio, a couple of speakers, already had a Pro Tools rig and all that, and kind of took it down there and set it up and worked from there for the next few months. So I spent the next year or so just kind of being pretty transient. Like I'd fly back to America when there were tours and sessions and stuff happening. And then when all that stuff was done, I'd fly right back down to Argentina and go hang out down there. And I made a ton of friends down there, and it was really cool down there. So I kind of made that my second home for a little while. But yeah, after a year or so of that, it was kind of time to, figure out what I was going to do. So I ended up coming out to Los Angeles and working at a woodshed and kind of settling down here. And I've been here ever since.
So was New York your first city in US? Were you in New Zealand before that?
Yeah, so I was in New Zealand before that, and I'd always wanted to live in New York. It was kind of like the dream from when I was quite young. Had no idea what I was going to do there. I'd always assumed like traveling and being a sound engineer was kind of an impossible thing to do. So the last thing I did before I left New Zealand was I went back to university, and I got a degree in communication studies, a Bachelor of Communication Studies. So I was kind of studying the media and the creative industries and things like that. I thought I'd get a job in management or something, like kind of get a real job, quote unquote. And so, yeah, when I moved to New York, all of a sudden, like a week later, I was working out of the studio called Spin Recording Studios in Queens, just outside of Manhattan. Mm-hmm. working for a guy called Bob Kinkle and his partner Dina Fanai. Bob was one of the founding guys from Trans-Siberian Orchestra, this band that kind of does a lot of touring every year, and they do these kind of like heavy metal Christmas concerts. And they've had like 9 platinum albums and all this, and Dina's done a lot of songwriting for a bunch of pop people, and they're both quite accomplished people. And so yeah, within a week I was kind of with them doing some sessions and whatnot, in this really, really cool studio called Spin Recording Studios out in Long Island City. And it was the first SSL that I'd ever seen in real life, because in New Zealand at the time, there were basically no SSLs at all. There's a couple floating around there now, but at the time, because New Zealand's so small, they just didn't exist. And so, yeah, they basically called me up, and the next day was going to be my first session. I never touched an SSL, so I was up till about 3 a.m. with the manual, kind of reading through and figuring out how to do it. And yeah, started working with them, and then from there I started working in Platinum Sound. So yeah, basically straight from New Zealand to New York City to kind of, you know, big bright lights. And
so have you worked on any large format console before coming to New York? How was that in how did you learn the craft in New Zealand?
Well, so when I was in New Zealand, like I studied, when I left school and like kind of went out into the real world, I studied at a place called the Music and Audio Institute in New Zealand. Mains is short for Mains, or long for Mains. So I kind of learned like my craft there. We had like Trident consoles and Soundcrafts and whatnot. I kind of learned how to work on consoles there. Nothing as big as an SSL, or nothing as kind of initially daunting as an SSL. But I learned like all the fundamentals through that. And so I knew signal flow, and I knew gain staging, and I knew basically how to use a console. And then the way SSLs are set up as well, you can read the manual for an SSL, and the manuals are really, really well written. You learn a lot from the manual. So if you read the manual, you basically know how to use the basics of the console. They're really exceptional manuals. So I had basic experience on consoles, and like a lot of recording experience before that. I definitely knew how to, you know, I knew microphones, and I knew how to run a recording session really well. But yeah, it was just kind of on a different scale when I got to New York. Ironically, it was a lot easier when I got there, because I was so used to working in just like small rooms and working around compromises and things to make things sound good. When you get an SSL that's in a really well-built, like amazing studio, everything's really effortless there. Like you just put up a pair of mics in front of something in a really nice room and turn up the fader, and you've got that sound right there. You're not like constantly kind of fighting and EQing and trying to fix things. So it was actually like a lot easier than I expected. But yeah, it's kind of a little bit thrown in the deep end, had to sink or swim a bit, and managed to swim.
So how did you get into actually doing sound?
So going back to when I was a teenager, kind of like a lot of people that are my age, I'm in my mid-30s now. When I started, I was on a little 4-track, those little Tascam Porta Studio cassette recorders. So when I was a teenager, I played guitar. Was never really into playing bands, and never really into songwriting. Kind of dabbled in it a little bit, but I never really took off, and I never really felt comfortable doing it. It just wasn't for me, which is unusual for like teenagers playing guitar, but I was just happy just playing guitar. So yeah, I bought a little Tascam Porta Studio, a little 4-track, and started playing around with that, and I found it really interesting. Just learning about kind of gain staging and, you know, recording things loud and turning it down so you get rid of the tape hiss, and you've only got 4 tracks, so learning how to bounce tracks onto one track and all that sort of stuff. And I found it really, really cool. And then yeah, local high school was doing, the headmaster had just built a little recording studio in the high school, and they were doing night courses for a little bit. So I signed up and did that. And that was kind of my first time in a recording studio, and I found it really amazing. I think that was on like an 8-track, like an 8-at, or maybe 2 8-ats synced together or something like that. So maybe 16 tracks, I can't remember. Pretty basic stuff, but I found it really amazing. And he let me come back. He basically gave me the keys to the studio, and he let me come back and use it on weekends and whatnot. So I'd get my friends to come in, and we'd record drums and guitar and stuff and mess around in there. And I found it really amazing. So from there, that's when I decided to kind of do something with it, and signed up at Mains, and, you know, got my diploma in sound engineering, and kind of went out and started working from there.
Okay, that sounds really interesting. It's probably time for us to fast forward back to now. And so here we are in your room, in your mixing room. We've been talking a little bit about it before we started streaming. And so we thought maybe we'd talk about the setup you have, because I noticed you have the attack walls. And could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so in my room, it's this little room inside a building in LA. It's not a purpose-built recording studio at all. It's basically, the building is basically what used to be a house. It's kind of set up as a bunch of studios and office space and stuff now. And Manly Labs is, they store a little bit of stuff here. They don't do manufacturing here. That's done out of their factory, but this is just like a little communications headquarters in LA for them. So it's basically set up in one of the rooms in this house. So I had to bring in the acoustic treatment with me. So I already owned the attack wall, because I used to have a studio to set up in my apartment, and just kind of built it up from there. I guess for people that don't know what the attack wall is, it's all these like these tube traps made by a company called ASC that you can see around me. And the idea of it is you kind of set them up in a semicircle, and they're meant to be like kind of absorbent enough that, and they're kind of built in a particular way that it basically sets up a room within your room when you're inside this kind of semicircle of tube traps. So they're meant to sit flush, basically fill the gap between the speakers and sit flush around the speakers. And so your speakers are effectively like soffit mounted, kind of like the big Augsburgers are in a studio, where there's meant to be no sound that goes back behind the speakers and bounces through, because any sound that gets behind the speakers will get kind of bounced around behind the attack wall, or eventually get around in front of the attack wall and back inside, where it gets absorbed by the trap. So you're meant to kind of basically hear the sound just directly from the speakers. I've kind of been experimenting with a little bit lately to like just not have such a dead space around me, just to try and keep it a bit more natural. So I've been experimenting with putting little gaps between them and moving them around, or just kind of putting them at the first reflection points and having a few more behind where the camera is right now. But they're really good at kind of taking an awful room that's like basically impossible to work out of, and getting it to like we were discussing before, to get you about 80% of the way, 80-90% of the way. I'm thinking of getting some I talked to some acousticians a few weeks back, and we kind of talked about taking it out and just kind of, you know, going back to basics and treating the first reflection points with panels and getting a cloud up and just figuring out, you know, what thicknesses to use and how much we want to absorb, and kind of moving stuff in and out from the walls and just kind of tuning it manually. But yeah, the attack wall is a really good way of just any space you go into, setting them up, and you got a usable mix space right there, and that sounds really good. See, the company is ASC. They're like really, really expensive to buy. I managed to pick them up used, and I got like a decent deal out of them. But yeah, I had them set up in my apartment in a room there, and then I came and got this room here and set them up, and basically the two rooms sound exactly the same. You could take it into just about any room, and you're going to be up and working, and you're going to have a really familiar sound and kind of know what you're dealing with right there. So yeah, that's what all those big tubes are right now.
Well, I can't also miss the EN2s that are right behind you, which I also happen to use every day and love them.
Yeah, I see the ones behind your head as well.
Exactly, the white ones. And so could we talk a little bit about those? So your feelings about them, maybe how you came by them, and what's the story behind you using APS, which is not a very big company?
So I came by them through Germano Studios. I did a session out there at Germano in New York, and just before I moved to Argentina that time, like about 6 months before. And we're doing a session with an artist called Alex Marshall, and went and set up a band and was, you know, kind of recording it through them. And I asked Matthew Sim, who was the house engineer there on the day, I was kind of asking him, like, what are these speakers? They sound really, really good. Like the kind of depth was really good in them, and just the sound stage is really natural, is really nice. And he said, they're prototypes that we're making with a company called APS, and this Polish company. And they'd been, I think, going back and forth a few and kind of refining the design or whatever. And they sounded really nice. I had a really good time working on them. We spent the whole day on them. And everything was really effortless on them. Everything was really natural, nothing fatiguing. They're really, really good. So later on that year, when I was about to move down to Argentina, I needed to get some speakers together. I called them up and I said, the speakers you got there are really nice. Can I buy them off you? They're like, no, there are speakers. You can't buy them. Like, click. And I was like, damn it. And then about 2 weeks later, I guess you guys must have just about finished production on the real ones or something. And so they called back and they're like, actually, yeah, if you want to buy them, you can buy them. We've got the real ones coming. So I said, great. I remember them being a lot smaller than they were. And so when I went to pick them up, I was like, oh no, these are huge. But I'd already like kind of got my heart set on them. I was ready to go. So I bought them and like bought a suitcase and kind of put one of them in one suitcase and another one in my other suitcase and a few clothes around them and took them down to Argentina. And they kind of got banged up on the way down there. Like, you know, the suitcase was destroyed when I got to Argentina. Like, it was like falling apart. There was holes in it, handle had broken off, but the speakers were fine inside. I'd kind of bubble wrap them and put stuff around them and tried to protect them as much as I could, made sure there were no liquids near them. So they came out, they were fine at the other end, but yeah, suitcase destroyed. I had to get another suitcase to bring it back. And so I didn't travel with them after that. I think that was it. Actually, no, I did travel with them once more. Yeah, I'm not going to travel with them anymore unless I get like an actual road case. But yeah, so they were the prototypes, and now I've got the real ones behind me, obviously. So I thought they were really great because Matthew was explaining to me they've got the active setting on them. So the frequency response goes down to like 35 hertz or something crazy. Yeah. So yeah, in my room here, I've got them set up and I've got the sub 12 here. And I was kind of trying to fiddle with the Aeons and the sub 12 and kind of get them working together. Mm-hmm. Ended up just taking the sub right out and kind of setting them up against the back wall and just like turning them on again. And the bottom end was plenty in there. Like there's more than enough in there. So I've just got them running by themselves and they kind of do everything I want it to do. Like when you turn them on, you play something, like a lot of people are looking for the subwoofer thinking mm-hmm. there's a hidden sub somewhere, but they just kind of effortlessly go down to the low end. I think if I needed to get like massive playback levels again, like I'd put the sub back in and kind of tune it and get it working. But for the volume levels that I work at, it's everything I need is in those two speakers.
Well, we also have now the extenders that you can hold on.
Yeah, I see that behind your head as well.
Yeah, which are basically meant to take over a little bit of that power that you need for the low end.
If you've got any in LA, I'd love to try them out. The one thing I find a bit weird about subwoofers sometimes is just having those, you got some of the sound coming from there and then some of the sound coming from somewhere else, and you kind of just feel a bit of a disconnect sometimes.
So that's the idea behind the extenders, not to have that. Yeah,
it's a really cool idea.
Yeah, good.
And obviously they're completely decoupled from each other, and yeah, it'd be quite cool to try them out. I think it's really cool.
Is there something in particular you could share with us on while you work in your work process that that make them interesting to you? Yeah,
well, I've kind of like I've never been a big fan of Augsburgers, and like the mains in a room, like they're good for cranking it up and, you know, like impressing the client sort of thing, but you tend to always just lose a bit of detail out of them, especially with like Augsburgers and those sorts of ones. Like the big kind of Genelecs and Quested and PMCs and stuff are a little bit nicer, but most studios have got those big speakers on the walls. They're kind of useless. You crank them up and you kind of feel the bottom end, but you can't do any detail work on them. And so I found with the Aeons, that kind of just did everything I needed to do. You could get quite a bit of level out of them, but you've also got the detail on the realism right there in front of you using those kind of near fields or midfields. So I first kind of realized how good they are when we were doing the Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds album. So we'd take them to every session that I did. So we started that album out at Woodshed Recording in Malibu. And I got rid of the NS10s off I think I had the NS10s there, but I set up the Aeons and put them there as well. And we got a pair of Augsburgers there as well. These really nice ones that are tuned to the room. They're really good. But yeah, started working on the Aeons. And then after a few hours of working, when we're doing something, I switched to the Augsburgers to crank it up when Nick wanted to listen to it loud. All of a sudden he kind of went, what happened? Like, what did you do? Like, what changed? I said, it's just on the big speakers. He said, no, go back to the speakers you're on. I preferred those. So I went back to the Aeons. Okay. And then a couple of days later, did the same sort of thing, wanted to crank it up. So I went back to the Augsburgers and he kind of, what's going on? Like, why did the sound just change? Or what everything just disappeared? What happened? So I went back to the Aeons and we ended up doing the whole album working on the Aeons. And then when we did overdubs in other studios, I'd take the Aeons with me. And then when we went to mix, we did it at Conway Studios and I took the Aeons there as well and set it up in the SSL bridge and basically did the whole album just listening 100% to Aeons. When there was no one there, like I'd switch to NS10s just to cross-reference, and I'd never really went to the bigs, not too much. But yeah, it's basically 99.9% done just on the Aeons themselves. We found when we went from room to room, they translated really nicely, and when it got sent to mastering, it didn't really come back sounding too much different. So we've done something right on it. So yeah, that's when I kind of realized just how reliable they were, and you know, everything you needed was basically in those two speakers right there.
So you basically don't use any other monitoring system to cross-reference? You only rely on the Aeons?
Yeah, in here you can't see them right now because I took them down just the other day, but I have a pair of little Genelecs as well. I bought them to be kind of a mobile speaker in case I need to go back down to Argentina, because they fit inside a little bag, and you know. But I have them as well. They kind of do kind of like the NS10 thing. They've got a little 5-inch woofer on them, and it's kind of good just to have a second set of speakers. But I ended up, when I've been messing around here the last couple of days, the last couple of weeks, I took them out just to kind of clear out everything in front of the Aeons. If you can kind of see, there's basically nothing on the monitor is set as far back as it can go. Like it's behind you know, it's kind of flush with the speakers. I was just trying to have nothing between me and the speakers. So I took the Genelecs out of here. I'll set them up somewhere else in the room or take them home or something like that. Because whenever I did flick to them, I'd find myself, whenever I wanted to do any detailed work, I'd flick back to the Aeons anyway. So yeah, and I do a lot of listening, like in the car, and I've got headphones as well. I always have my Sennheiser 600s with me, and a set of these little Bose Bluetooth headphones as well. So I cross-reference on that, but all the detailed work is basically on the Aeons.
We also talked about the correction software or hardware solutions for rooms and
or lack of it. Yeah.
Or lack of it. Could you share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't use it. I don't really like it. I've tried it a couple of times before and I just don't like it. And I don't really like the idea of it as well. I much prefer just learning what you've got and just getting used to the space you're in and just kind of compensating yourself on that. I've used the KRK system before. They do one called the Ergo or ERGO or something. I just remember being in a studio in New York a couple of years ago where they had that. And I didn't realize, but they'd used it and set up the room and used the measurement mics, and this little Ergo system was correcting or whatever. And there was just something a bit weird going on. I just didn't quite understand. There's just something kind of flat. You kind of, when you use those systems, you kind of lose all the depth and realism. This kind of just flat hi-fi sound comes in front of you. And I switched it off, and all of a sudden you could kind of feel the speakers working again. And you just kind of, you learn what the room sounds like and you just compensate yourself. I guess those things can be all right for kind of cleaning up the low end and the lower mids, but when they're doing correction on like the upper mids and high frequencies, they've got no reason to be doing that sort of stuff. Like, you just use your ears, and you don't need to be turning some frequencies up by 0.5 of a dB and other things down by 2 dB and stuff like that. You just kind of let the room do its thing, and you just use your ears. And then with those systems as well, like, they're kind of pointless when they're fixing the bottom end, because you move back a couple of feet and it's just a completely different sound, and that's actually made it worse than what it was before. So I much prefer kind of setting the speakers up in the room, finding like the sweet spot of where you got to sit or where you got to set the speakers up or whatever, and then just kind of set up your acoustic treatment and use the treatment to kind of fix the problems that are there, rather than just trying to get an EQ to fix it. So yeah, like, a lot of people try to get me to try SonarWorks, and they all swear by it, but I'm not a fan of that sort of stuff. The little Genelecs I have, they have a built-in system called the SAM system, and it comes with a little microphone and stuff like that. And I kind of got that so when I go on tour and I set up in hotel rooms and dressing rooms, I do a lot of mixing when I'm on the road. So I sometimes take those with me and set it up. And then when I use the correction system, like, it makes them a little bit brighter, which is cool, but it doesn't actually make the work you do any better, or it doesn't make the translation any better or anything like that. And yeah, like, SonarWorks even tries to get you to use it on your headphones, which I think is just a kind of a ludicrous idea. Like, the headphones are two little speakers in front of your ears. They're powered by an amplifier. You don't need to change anything or like fix anything. Just listen to the headphones and get used to them, and then you're good to go. So especially with something like, you know, a nice pair of Sennheisers, or if you're using Audi's or Grados or whatever, you don't need to use any EQ fixing on those. Just listen to them, get used to the natural sound, and then work from there. So I don't use any digital correction on here. Yeah, that's kind of the other reason I don't like it as well, is like, there's an extra, well, not so much with SonarWorks, but with these other systems, there's like an extra digital stage between you and the speakers, which you can normally kind of hear. Like, a lot of the systems just got cheap, like, digital, like A to D and D to A converters on them. you can kind of hear that going. It's just something in between you and the music and you and the mixing that you're doing. So yeah, I like to keep it natural. I like just to use analog amplifiers that go into speakers and, you know, deal with it from there. But I think it's much better going back to the fundamentals and just fixing your room, getting used to what you're hearing, and then just, you know, doing the rest on your own.
Right. So basically it boils down to using your software in the brain instead of in a computer.
Yeah.
I see you don't have like a mixing board. So are you working in the box or is it a hybrid solution? How do you work nowadays?
I got a hybrid solution going on here. I love mixing on consoles, but I hate recall. I think like recall sucks. Like, it's not only is it inconvenient, but I kind of learned, like, when working on big SSLs, if you set up a mix on an SSL or set up anything on an SSL, if you hit save on the SSL, then immediately you hit recall. It'll tell you you'll see the faders will snap just a tiny little bit, and you'll see it'll tell you to like switch these EQs just a tiny little bit. And I kind of start to realize how inaccurate that recall is on the SSL. Because when you got a mix going, when you got your perfect mix done, if you grab the vocal fader and you turn it up 1 dB, like, you can hear that. All of a sudden the vocal is a dB too loud. It just kind of sits out a little bit too much, or it's just overpowers everything's a little bit too much. You had it perfect. There was no reason to turn it up a dB. So in the SSLs, when you hit recall on them and all the faders just snap just a little bit, and some stuff goes down just like half a dB or a dB, and some stuff goes up, all of a sudden your mix has kind of changed quite a bit. And it'll kind of drive me nuts. So I started to try and not have to rely on recall at all, because everything you're recalling, everything's just a slight tiny bit off. It's just kind of a nightmare to do. But I still like the analog summing thing. I still like going out and having analog stuff on the master bus and like a little bit of summing stuff going on. I found it just kind of just opens up things a little bit, and you can just kind of push things a little bit harder, and it kind of works. So I like having the best of both worlds. So basically I have a hybrid setup. I have, maybe I'll just move the laptop closer. So I have a little Thermionic Culture Purple Bastard as my summing mixer. And I chose that one deliberately because it doesn't really have any settings on it. It's got basically 16 channels, and you can turn those channels on or off. There's no like knobs or faders or pans or buttons or anything. Like, it's just on or off, and that's it. So I leave them on the whole time. I don't touch them. So it means every time I pull up a Pro Tools session, my levels are exactly as they were before. Like, nothing's changed. Nothing's going to be a little bit off. That's that. It's got a attitude setting, which is like a harmonic distortion thing, and it's got an air setting, which when you use a harmonic distortion, it rolls off the top end, so the air band will kind of open up the top end a bit. So it's really cool for sound, but every time you use it, you're not going to like be changing your mix every time. It's just kind of easy to recall. And then I have a lot of stuff on my master bus as well, or a few nice pieces on my master bus. I've got a Manley variable moo. I don't know if I can zoom in on there. There's like a variable moo. There's a Manley new moo, which is their other like tube compressor they do. There's an SSL Fusion there. And then everything goes back in through my little Crane Song head, which is the one with the little green knobs there. It's my A to D converter. So just from a lot of working and kind of messing with doing console mixes and then Pro Tools mixes, and I found plugins have got to a point where they kind of emulate what hardware does pretty closely now. If you compare like Universal Audio 1176 compressor plugin, and then the actual hardware Universal Audio reissue compressor, whatever they do, it's pretty much the same thing. Like, if you did a blind test on it, 9 times out of 10, you're not really going to pick the difference. I think the hardware is really cool for tracking, but once you've tracked and it's, you know, digitally in the box and you're there, going out and using the hardware versus just using the plugin, like it's so close now. One more generation of plugins to come out, and I think we'll pretty much have the same sort of thing. So most things I found you can kind of get away with just using the plugins, and you're there or thereabouts. And then the master bus is the only thing I found that the plugins don't quite nail just yet. Compressors, EQs, whatever on individual instruments, it's close enough for me. I'm happy with the plugin, so I use that. But the master bus, I still kind of like using hardware on that. So I can use the Numu, which is the really punchy tube compressor. It's quite clean sounding. It's got a lot of punch. It's got a lot of clarity to it. Or I've got the Verimu, which is like the kind of softer, warmer, I think in the manual it describes it as giving your mix a big hug, which is kind of what it does. So I can use one of those two things, and yeah, a bit of analog stuff just on the master bus, just to help kind of get the size and get the warmth, and just you can kind of push into a little bit harder than you can with plugins, and it translates a bit better. Yeah.
I see you're using Apollo 16. Is that what you're using to take out the 16 channels out of your Pro Tools rig as buses, some kind of stems that you do?
Yeah. So I've got the Apollo X16, which is the latest one they do. The conversion on it's pretty good. I originally had an Apogee Symphony, the Mark 1, but I've learned with the Symphonies, when you put 2 cards in there to get 16 outputs, the fan basically spins 100% of the time. And it's really difficult to do anything about that. It's a really loud fan. So unless you've got a separate machine room to put that thing in, it's a nightmare having it in the same room as you. I had it, and as soon as I did my first mix with it, I thought, this thing's going. This thing can't stay. So I sold it and I bought the Apollo X16, and the conversion sounds pretty much the same. You didn't really lose anything out of it. So the 16 outputs of that feed the summing mixer. So that's the digital to analog is from there. And then the Crane Song head does the analog to digital at the end to get it back into Pro Tools. But yeah, the Apollo's doing the output stuff.
So in order to do that, do you kind of set up a template where you have like drums, and then you have the low end or something, guitars, keyboards? How do you do that?
Yeah, so in my template, it'll change a little bit from mix to mix depending on what's in there. But for most like pop, like urban electronic sort of stuff, there's in my template, I've got 8 auxiliary channels set up at the end of my session. There's like the main drums, there's the other drums that like that's a percussion or one hits or cymbals or whatever. There's drum effects, which is like my parallel compression, any reverbs or anything will go to that. I've got my main music bus, I've got my music duct bus, which I'll come back to, my music effects bus, which is all reverbs and any parallel stuff or whatever, my dry vocals and my vocal effects. So basically all of those are set to instantly go out channels 1 to 16. And then I everything gets summed from there and I work on it from there. Most of those buses are pretty self-explanatory. The music duct bus, I just have it set up. So there's a send going off my vocal dry bus I call it the Vox Ducker. And then on the music duct bus, I'll have at the moment I use the FabFilter Pro MB, the multi-band compressor, and I just have one band set up on it in the mid-range, and I'll play with where it starts and ends, but it's normally from about 200 hertz. Sometimes it'll go a bit higher, up to like 300 or 400 hertz, but like 200 or 300 hertz up to about 3 or 4K. And when the Vox comes in, it'll just duck that band by like a dB or 2 dB maybe. Like if I want to be really heavy-handed, maybe 3 dB, but normally like 1 to 2 dB. And it just means you don't need to have the vocals so loud to sit in front of the music. As soon as the vocal comes in, the musical instruments will just sit back just a little bit while the vocal's going. Then as soon as the vocal's gone, they come back up on the front again. I don't have that on my drums because it's just weird when you got that sort of compression that's got attack and release. It kind of just messes with transients. I let the drums just do their thing. And it just pushes the music back just a little bit. Doesn't push the music effects back. I still leave any ambience and stuff I've got kind of going. But yeah, just the main music, it pushes it back, and you don't hear it happening because it's only when the vocal's in, and it's quite a transparent sort of way of doing it. So yeah, it means you don't have to like worry so much about EQing vocal frequencies out of music. You can still let the music sound like what you want it to sound like, but the vocal will always kind of sit out front really effortlessly. And it's not pushing your bus compressor so hard, and it's not pushing into your limiter as hard. It kind of everything just glues together a lot better.
Speaking of EQing and dynamics, what's your take on dynamic EQ?
I've started to get into it. A couple of months ago, I bought the FabFilter Pro Q3, which makes it really easy to switch bands between just normal EQ and dynamic EQ. And I've started to use it more and more and more. I think it's a really cool thing. Like there's this kind of, like a lot of purists, they've got this kind of belief that with EQ, you're meant to kind of like mainly do subtractive EQ, try and avoid additive EQ, just do subtractive EQ, which is all well and good when you're trying to remove problem frequencies and fix issues and stuff like that. But often if you go through a mix and just kind of do subtractive stuff, you listen to your mix after you've done it all and kind of put it all together, and you go back to the rough mix, and all of a sudden you've just lost all your energy. when you're taking all these frequencies, you're just kind of removing energy at the same time. So I've started to kind of mess a lot more. I've always used multiband compression a lot to kind of do that sort of thing. But I started messing with dynamic EQs to fix kind of problem areas. And I find it kind of helps to keep the energy where it was, but just kind of remove things when they become problematic. Yeah, I think it's really, really cool. I was kind of, when it started to become a big thing, like 5 or 6 years ago, I was always a little bit skeptical about it. I didn't quite understand it. I didn't, it's like, what is this new fandangled digital thing? Like, we've got good EQs, that have been around for years. You don't need this new thing. But the more I use it, the more I kind of get into it and embrace it. I think it's really cool.
Are you a kind of guy who loves pushing the mix really hard, or are you conservative in terms of levels? And how do you like the master to sound?
No, I do push things quite hard. I think it's more of a reflection of me. Like, it's kind of everything I do, like kind of, like wanting a slight change in my life, move down to Argentina. Like when I was younger, like I was always the guy that was just like drinking a little bit too much at the parties. I was always kind of being a guy that would just kind of push the limits or push the boundaries a little bit. I guess that's how I'd like end up working in New York, kind of, don't do things by halves. Like, if I'm going to do something, I really do it. So often I've got to pull back when I'm pushing against a master bus. I end up kind of slamming things quite a lot. But no, like there's a lot of talk about the loudness wars, and there's a lot of talk about the loudness wars being over, which they are, but loudness won. So I kind of embrace loudness. I kind of accept that it is part of the sound of today's music. So you've got to use limiters to get things loud, and you've got to mix around the limiters and kind of make it work with the limiters. It's one of the big things I learned at Platinum Sound when I was working with Serge and Jerry there. Like, Jerry loves loud mixes. He's always telling you to push the master bus louder and get it louder. And it's like pumping and distorting, and you're kind of wincing, but he still wants it louder. So you got to figure out a way of getting it loud, but not having it fall apart and kind of making it work. And yeah, I remember early on having a chat to Serge about it, and Serge said, look, it's the sound of, it was like 2012 at the time, but it's the sound of music today. You just have to embrace it and make it work. So yeah, that's why I do like having an analog mix bus. You can kind of push things a little bit harder without having them fall apart. You can like push things really hard into a Varimu, and it just doesn't fall apart. It doesn't distort. It doesn't pump. Like, if you kind of set it right, it does give your mix a big hug and present it to the listener. So it means when you are trying to get loudness on the master bus at the end, whether it's for the final mix or just for the references you're giving the listener, it's not pumping and distorting and breaking up. You can still get these nice full energetic mixes without all the artifacts you normally get just from slamming a limiter on and hoping for the best. So yeah, often when I start a mix, I'll start pushing things quite hard, and as I get further into the mix, I've got to start pulling it back. I do have a VCA that is assigned to all of those 8 buses that go out to the summy mixer that'll turn it up or down. So I can quite easily, if I find myself pushing a bit too hard, just turn those auxes down, and it doesn't change the integrity of the mix as well. If you pull all your channels down, it messes with any parallel compression you've got, and it's, can kind of just change the mix you've got. So that VCA that's set to the 8 auxes, I can pull that down a little bit, and it just doesn't hit the outboard as hard. Or I can turn it up and make it hit it a bit harder. So yeah, generally, I'm getting mixes quite loud, but I kind of also make them sound good when they're loud as well, which I think is really important. You can't just slam on a limiter and hope for the best there.
From what you've been telling us, I kind of gathered that this, what got you there is a very extensive amount of work, often at very ungodly hours to normal people. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what it takes to really become an engineer of that level?
Oh God, yeah, it's the best way I've heard it described is it's not a job, it's a lifestyle, which it totally is. Like, New York was a massive eye-opener for me. When I was at Platinum Sound, our average week there was, like, a typical week there was about 95 hours a week. We'd start every day by about 1 p.m., depending on what was happening. We'd normally be in there by like 12 or 1 p.m. 2 p.m. was like a late start for us, but normally about 1 p.m. And we'd finish on average about 6 a.m., I think, 6 to 7 a.m. by the time we'd wrapped up recording sessions, done rough mixes or whatever, backed up and, packed up and all that. and times that by 6 days a week at least, and then often you get called in on the Sunday as well if there was something happening. So yeah, it was kind of, you get used to kind of doing some brutal hours there and becoming a night owl and just kind of working through. Like I was saying before, when we finished up the Miguel album, we started on the Sunday afternoon, and it had to be delivered to the label by the Thursday night, I think. So we started on Sunday afternoon and just worked non-stop for 4 days. Like Miguel would crash on the couch or in the lounge while I'd be up all night doing mixes. And then I think one of the days I managed to sneak home to get a change of clothes. SSL had the head office in the same building as us at Platinum Sound. So after the third day or something, I went in the elevator down to them and I said, hey, I've been working for 3 days. Have you guys got any merch or swag that I can have? So they gave me a couple of t-shirts. I at least had some fresh t-shirts to wear. And then managed to get like a nap on the couch on the Wednesday afternoon for an hour or two, I think. And then, yeah, went down to Sterling Sound to do the mastering, and we needed to do some tweaks. Had to race back to the studio to do some tweaks and reprint and send it off. And so yeah, it's pretty brutal hours you got to do. There's no like 9 to 5 sort of thing that we do in this world. And typically when clients want something, they want it they want it yesterday. So you got to be pretty on to it. So now that I'm freelance, I can choose my hours a little bit more. I typically start early afternoons and I try and finish like kind of mid to late evening. It's kind of rare that when I'm working on my own, it's quite rare that I'll work past about 1 a.m. now. I normally try and finish up by about midnight and go home and just continue the next day. But yeah, with clients, it's often long hours. When we did the Nick Cave album, we're doing like 12-hour recording sessions in the studio. So we'd normally start about 10 a.m. and go through to about 10 p.m. But then I'd be up till about 4 or 5 or 3 or 4 in the morning, kind of doing rough mixes and tweaking stuff and editing and just kind of tidying stuff up. And then, go home, get a few hours sleep up the next morning and back in setting up and getting ready. And, 10 a.m. you're recording again. So you still have those bursts of kind of long hours and long days and whatnot. But I try and ever since the Platinum Sound days, I value my sleep now. I love getting 8 hours of sleep. So whenever I can get 8 hours of sleep, I totally do it.
So now that we know how hard it is to get there, is there anything else you could share with us for people who maybe would like to or aspire to become, somebody in this very difficult
I get
area?
I get asked that quite a lot. Like, what's the career path to become like basically a full-time working sound engineer? And I honestly don't know what it is. Like, it's so impossible to do. It takes like an obscene amount of hard work, and you've got to be really dedicated. It's got to be your number one thing. It can't be your number two thing. Like when you do this sort of thing, like family and relationships and stuff almost have to take a back foot a little bit. This has got to be your main thing. So yeah, like when I was at Platinum Sound, we found like with a lot of the interns and assistants that would come through, I found probably about 1 in 10 kind of had what it took to become like a working engineer. It was a lot of things. Like they'd have to have the right work ethic and be prepared just to do stupid hours on no sleep to kind of get where they want to go. It was like an attitude thing as well. They needed to, know they had to do what it took to become the engineer, like get rid of all egos and anything like that, and just do the right thing. Be the right person, be the right person with the right people. If they wanted to be like a musician or a producer or something, or if that was what they really wanted to do, it was just never going to work. Normally my first question I'd ask, or when I first kind of interview people that want a job, working for a studio mat or whatever, is like, what's the end goal? If the end goal is not to become like a working sound engineer or working mixing engineer, like it's 9 times out of 10, it's a waste of time for them. If they want to really become a producer, a beat maker, or, a studio manager or something like that, going through the sound engineering route is not the way. So I always recommend that people get education. There's a lot of debate about it, if you need to be educated or not to get a job. Like the degree doesn't help you get a job at all in most cases, but it's when people have a degree in sound engineering or a diploma or whatever it is, like it shows that A, they've got a basic understanding of how it works, and B, most importantly, they've proven that they can start something and finish it. So when you sign up to do a degree, like it's a 4-year commitment and you're working in a disciplined environment and you're working to someone else's standards and all that sort of stuff. And so if they can complete that, it shows that they can start something and finish something and work to a particular standard that's been set for them. Whereas people that are self-taught and just like read gear sluts and YouTube tutorials and Pensado's place and stuff like that, like you learn a lot off that, but there's no kind of discipline and that sort of thing. You're kind of just floating through and doing whatever you want. So not that it can't be done that way, but there should be some sort of discipline, like in the early part of your career that you're following. And it's normally a good sign that if you can do that, then you can maybe go into the next step and go from there. So I always recommend having an education. Whether or not that's financially viable is a completely different question. I know like in America, tuition fees are kind of horrendous here. People have come out of audio school with $100,000 debt, which is insane. I was lucky in New Zealand, like our government subsidizes tuition fees, so it's not as expensive. It was like $4,000 or $5,000 a year, or $3,000 or $4,000 a year or something. So it's different. Me saying you should get educated, I didn't have to come out with $100,000 in debt. I don't know how you do that over here. But yeah, like education doesn't make you any dumber. It doesn't make you any worse. Like it's definitely helpful to have if you can afford it to make that work. And then the second step you've got to do to get a career going is you've got to get credits. So if you come out of audio school, if you just start by yourself, teaching yourself, and you just work out of a bedroom studio at home, like you're not going to work with the big names, and you're not going to get credits, and you're not going to learn what that world sort of works like and how it is. So I think it's pretty important to try and get a job at like a big studio. I think definitely moving to like a main music center, like in LA or New York or Nashville or London or Berlin, or, you know, there's tons of them all over the place, or Austin or whatever. It's definitely very helpful. We are around a lot of people that are living and breathing music. It's not just a hobby for them. There's not just one or two bands in town that have kind of made it. You know, there's like a whole community of people there. I think that's really helpful. And yeah, like it's kind of one of the big differences when I was working in New Zealand with a lot of the bands there. You kind of, when you're the engineer in the studio there, you're kind of one of the big fish in the studio. You're kind of calling a lot of the shots and kind of directing things and, you know, deciding when you start and finish and how things are going to be done. You move to New York and start working a session there, and also the engineer is like the kind of the smallest guy in the room. There's a lot of big personalities and a lot of people that know what they're doing. You start learning a bit more how to work to other people's time frames and other people's standards and how they want to work, and kind of hearing and thinking through their ears and their brain and what they're kind of, you know, kind of trying to get their perception of things. And it's quite a different world when you're like the main person in the studio. And I think that was really helpful as well. So if you can get a bit of an education, get some experience in a big studio with like established players, or working under, like a lot of friends I've got have worked under big mixing engineers and kind of learned how they worked, or big producers and worked for them. So kind of just getting a bit of eye-opening, getting a bit of an eye-opener in the real world is a really helpful thing as well. And then you can start doing your freelance thing and going from there. I think, yeah, I think that's the way to do it. But in saying that, I know that not everyone can do that. Like there's not that many opportunities out there. But generally the cream will kind of rise to the top a little bit. Someone really early on in my career, this guy Nick Mendes in New Zealand, he's a freelance engineer over there. I met him early on when I was still a really young guy and trying to figure out how to, you know, get into studios and get work going. Because in New Zealand at the time, there was one big studio in the whole country, and that was it. Even now, there's only like one or two big studios in the country, and that's it. So there wasn't opportunities for everyone to start the internship or be the assistant. And he said to me, if you really want it, it'll happen. And at the time, I was like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, you know, it's not just going to happen. But I kind of understand now. If you really, really want it, then it'll eventually happen. But you've got to really, really want it. You've got to be calling all those studios like every 2 months, trying to get in there. You're going to be emailing producers and mix engineers and, you know, trying to get in there. And eventually, out of these hundreds of people that you'll kind of hit up and pester over a year or 2 years, one of them will finally email you back, and you'll get that little opportunity. And then when you get that opportunity, you've got to throw everything at it. You know, your family, your partner, and everything's got to take a little bit of a back step for a couple of years. And that's what I kind of learned. Like, if you really, really want it, it'll happen like that. If you only kind of want it, but you also want to travel and, you know, go on holidays and do your own music and stuff like that, it probably won't happen. But if you really, really want it to happen, then yeah, eventually something will kind of click. But at the same time, yeah, you got to have things go your way. Like a lot of people, if they don't have support from their parents or something, they can't just up and move to Los Angeles, or at least they think they can't. Maybe you just got to try it. Yeah, you got to like take a lot of risks as well. But yeah, without the risk, there's no reward there. So it was kind of me, like, yeah, just moved to New York, start working in a big studio, like threw everything at it, and then that kind of, yeah, that happened to work out for me.
Well, thanks a lot. Thank you very much for sharing this with us. It's been a fantastic hour, and we're very proud to have you as APS user. So
yeah, that's cool. I like having them here. It's great.
We'll be looking forward to more of your work, and we'd like to say hello to everybody out there, and look out for next episodes. Bye for now.
All right.